Well, we've got our basic structure all completed. Now we're just going to do some variations. Now that hot mop roof that we did earlier, a lot of people don't relate to that, so we're just going to show you another way of making tar paper roofs. Now for the paper for this, instead of using the Kleenex that we used earlier, I like to use the paper out of a telephone book. Very easy to just cut strips of this out. Telephone books are great because you get a new source every year. Doesn't take an awful lot of this in order to cover a small roof, but just look for areas in which there's not printing. Areas like that if you need larger areas. Main thing is just to cut several strips and have them ready. Now this is a little building I built years ago, and we're going to start by just applying paint right along the bottom. This is Tester's flat black paint. I use it a lot. It's one of my favorites, and a very soft brush. Again, a very soft brush. Sometimes in my work I use stiff brushes, sometimes soft. So here you see I'm dipping first into the thinner, then into the paint. I'm just putting a very thin coat of black on. Want to just have enough on here to cover it, and just really sort of like a dark stain. This is a type roof you'll see very common in so many parts of the earth. Now while that is still wet, we stick our newspaper on there. Might need to hold it in place with your finger. And again, we just go right back into the thinner, into our paint again, and this time we brush right over it. This allows this really thin coat of paint, allows the paint to sink down into the paper and hold it in place. Although what you may want to do is you may want to glue these on with Elmer's glue. It's a personal choice. But this is just a very easy way of doing it. Now we want to put on a little piece here over the top of it. You can run these strips the whole length of the roof if you choose to, but I think it looks better to have several different relatively short sections of roofing material applied. Add a little more paint, put the next row up, overlapping it a little bit. You don't want to overlap it by much, but just a little bit. Now these strips that I'm putting on here are about 1 inch wide. So in O scale that's about 4 feet. Not really a standard size for roofing paper, so just sort of go by what looks right to you and what appeals to your eye. Now we're working right up at the peak of the roof there, getting the paint on. And we add one more strip right up there at the very top, bringing that right up to the very peak of the roof. And again, very thin paint that we're putting on here, very thin. Okay. Just brushing down a little bit to get a uniform coating of paint. You don't want a real thick coat here, and this is what it looks like while it's wet. And this is how it looks when it's dry. You can see those individual sheets, and you just take scissors and trim off at the end. And then we want to let this, make sure that this is very thoroughly dry before we do the next step. Now here I've got some light tan paint. The exact color doesn't make a lot of difference. It's just a very light color. This is a color of sandstone. Put a little squirt on a paper plate. Blending it out so you can see it there, but you also notice I've got some water over there to the side. So you can see this is a real watery batch of paint that I have here. And we just let it We flow on, working at the top, and we just run it across and pretty much let it flow down on its own. See how I do that? Very easy. You'll notice it pools up down at the bottom edge, so we'll want to take that off. You do that by just running the brush back across it. Now you want to do very light coats. Ideally, when I do this in 2 or 3 light coats. I'll start some fresh staining marks right at the edge of one of the sheets of tar paper. Each layer is a little different. And again, any that builds up along the edge, just run a dry paintbrush along there. You can squeeze the paint out of this onto a cloth. It absorbs very readily. And we just want to do this and have a few areas after you've done it once. Just see how that sort of gives little stripes of things running down. Nothing real distinct here. We just want several really light layers of paint. You might want to add a little darker brown or something like that. This shows up close. Be dragging the dry paintbrush along to absorb the paint. Let each of these coats dry thoroughly, then come back and put a second or a third coat on. Very easy technique. And you end up with a nice weathered tar paper roof. Very common throughout the country for sheds, small buildings. And when it's dry, that's how that looks. Now another type of roof that I always liked, I remember this a lot when I was in California as a child, and that was a composition roof like tar paper, but they would put sand on it at the factory and then paint it red. And I've always just really enjoyed those red roofs. I don't see them here in Alaska. I don't even know if they still make this material or not, but when I was a child there was a lot of it. So what I put on there is black construction paper, and here I've got water in that little plate. Using a large brush, I take acrylic black paint and I just paint a thin coat over the construction paper, over the whole sheet of construction paper. You want this thin because you really want this to be absorbed by the paper. It's going to do two things. One, it's going to distort the paper. Wet paper gets distorted, and that adds to the realistic look of our roof. But we just want to go over this. You could use just the black construction paper for this, but it looks better with a coat of black paint on it, in my opinion. And this helps seal it. In addition to causing little distortions, this seals the paint, because when we go to add the red on, we don't want the red really being absorbed into this black construction paper. We want the layer of red paint to lay on top. So you may need to put 2 coats of this on here. If you need a thicker coat, just add some of the black directly to it. Just whatever it takes in order to get a nice coat of black paint on here. I'm using here just a cheap 1-inch throwaway brush. Nothing elaborate, nothing very special. Now I'm using some Naphthol Crimson. This is a bright red. This is what looks good to me. Now you don't have to use red if you don't want to. In fact, in a lot of parts of the country, green is very common. I see green a lot more than I see red anymore. But here I'm putting the red on full strength. And see, when I put it on, I'm not really trying to get an even coat all over. I'm just trying to get the red on there. I like those variations in the color that you see there. And as this dries, these variations are going to come out more than they are right now. So after that's completely dry, then we're going to mix a bunch of colors. Here I got some red, and I've got some different colors of brown and some blacks and dark brown, and we're just going to be mixing all these colors together. And this sort of gives you the kind of colors that you would get show up on this type of roofing as it would come from the factory and after you got installed in place. So what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be using a straight up and down stippling motion. Like that. See how I just apply that like that and just bang that in there like that. And this just produces another coat with a variation of red, and we want to have variety in the colors here. Very easy effect to do, very quickly done. I don't want to brush in circles or anything like that. I want to keep up this stabbing motion with this cheap brush. This is a way of putting this on there. Now later we're going to cut this individual strips, and little different areas of variation are going to be placed next to each other to help accentuate. So there it is, all dry, and you can see how that looks. See, we got those dark areas in there, and we've got the other areas. Now I just use a paper cutter and just going to cut this into strips. Again, I'm going to cut it into strips 1 inch wide. Cut off those end pieces that I don't want to use, or I don't have any of the paint. Discard those, and we're just going to cut our nice strips out of this here. And again, as I said before, these are going to be 1 inch wide. This makes for 4 foot wide in real life material if you're modeling in O scale. If you're modeling in HO, 1/2 inch strips would be more appropriate. And we just cut these nice straight strips. If you don't have a paper cutter, you can do this with a razor blade and a ruler. You can do it with scissors, but I have a paper cutter, and I just like the fact that it makes for a nice, quick, and easy way of doing this. Very easily done. Now this color here, as you're looking at it, this doesn't look like a very bright red. But when it's actually on the roof of the model, and you actually look at the roof of the model, it looks pretty good. You can make it brighter if you want. As these colors dry that you use, it's always hard to tell exactly what they're going to be when they're dry. But if you want a more colorful roof, just add some more color to it. Very easily done. So there we got enough paper there in that one time to do quite a bit. So I've cut it into smaller pieces, about 3 inches long. And I've got the basic roof on the structure again. Now this time, instead of running horizontally, we're going to run these vertically. And in order to make them nice and easy to do, we're going to lay them in place, and we're actually going to bend over the top. So just lay it in place on your structure, line up the bottom, just bend over the top of that paper. That puts a little bit of a kink in it, makes it a little easier to put on. Now here I'm just going to glue these straight on using Elmer's glue. Just put the glue on, smooth it out with a paintbrush. These paintbrushes can be cleaned up. This is the same brush I used for doing my painting earlier, but now I'm using it to apply the glue. I like to work in a small area at a time. Put the glue on more than just the area directly underneath this particular piece of the tar paper. And again, we got that little notch there at the top. We just put that piece in place, press it down, take our next piece, do exactly the same thing. We're going to put it in place. Again, we got that little notch there at the top, little folded area, and we just overlap it. Very easy to do, and we just proceed along. Now here, not wanting to waste any of the material, we're going to put a smaller piece on. This is what they would do when they got to the ends of these rolls of material. they would just put the little bit of the rolls on there. So what we're doing here is, again, we're spreading out the Elmer's cement. Again, this is full strength. Again, we spread it out to the left beyond where we're going to put our next couple of rows. We always have a little bit of sticky area before we put the next batch of glue on. Now this one, I put the little segment down at the bottom like this, little piece, overlapping the piece to the right, and then just simply put another piece right on over the top of that, just like that. And when you line these up on the right hand side of these individual strips, they don't have to be exact. There's always variation here, but the people who put these roofs on are generally don't use an awful lot of overlap because they don't want to waste any material. Materials very hard to come by at a time in the past, so things were rarely thrown away. They always did the maximum use out of the material they could. And again, we're just going to put a little more glue on. Very easily done. And as before, we brush on the full strength Elmer's glue. And we just keep adding these layers till we get right over there next to the false front. There, as you can see on the false front, we got an area that we don't need to cover with a full strip, so we're just going to cut down a piece, make it a little thinner. When you work with a standard size building like this, you can even use your paper cutter and a mark on it and cut all your strips so they're exactly the right length to go on automatically. Just like that. Just bring that right up against the front. And there's how that looks dry. There you can see that while it's all painted a very similar color, the individual variations show up quite nicely when you look at the building. Now what they would do in real life, of course, is they would come back after this was done. They would put tar, fresh tar. Tar was readily available, and they would just put it over the joints. And we're doing that using full strength black paint. We would put it not only on the vertical parts, but also where pieces overlapped. You could even take a piece of tar paper, even a different color piece of tar paper, and patch the roof or anything like that you choose to do. So here you can see that I've gone ahead and finished putting that tar on all the different seams there. That's how those seams look, and it looks just like they got up there and put tar on to protect it. You also want to put tar right around the front where this roofing paper joins to the false front itself. Now, if you want a more weathered look, it's very easy to do. Since we have that natural wood of that subroof showing through, we can take some of this material and just tear it. This is something, if you've seen old weathered buildings that have tar paper roofs, you'll see that they tear quite a bit. Now you don't want to tear it so these pieces meet exactly, but I've got an area there, and now here, instead of brushing the glue onto the roof, what you want to do is you want to put it actually on the back of the tar paper itself. And we again just use, now this time I'm using a little stiffer brush, so I want a little more control with it. Just brush it right onto the back of the paper, smooth it out, peel it up very carefully, lift it, put it into position, Rub it down with your finger. Rub or use a rolling. You don't want to get a lot of glue on that. You want to be careful you don't put glue on the top of it. And the other piece that we had that was torn, we'll do exactly the same thing here. Add this other torn piece right here. Just like so. I want to keep these straight up and down. So there it looks like we got an area where it's torn away. What you can also do after this dries, you can go back if you want with the edge of your Exacto knife and run that edge right along the very edge of that tar paper and peel it up a little bit to show it coming loose. Now one thing I like to do is I like to think that guys back when would use old signs and any old chunks of wood they could find to make repairs to the roof. So rather than shipping in some tar paper from Seattle or something like that, somebody in Alaska, well, they would just find some old sign someplace and bring it home and nail that up on place. In fact, a lot of times instead of wooden signs, these would actually be metal signs, which would be even better. Now I cut these out of magazines. You can make these on your printer with your computer, but I find cutting them out of magazines, I like the shiny effect. It makes it look a little more metallic, the quality of print in a glossy magazine. There's lots of books available that have old advertisements in it. So you can just cut those out and in essence nail them on like we're doing here. This is a quick and colorful way of making the roof look more exaggerated. And you can use a variety of color of signs and just sort of play with them until you find the one you like. See just what's going to look good to your eye. There are no rules with this kind of thing. Okay, I like this dark one. I also try to pick signs that have distinct lettering on them when I do this. I want the lettering to show up clearly so that people can realize that that's what somebody did, was they took an old sign and nailed it up there. This is the type of little thing you add to your model that people who are looking at it will note, especially people who don't know a lot about modeling. Well, these are the type of things that really catch the eye. Very quick, very easy to do. Like so many of the techniques we use, doesn't take a lot of time or a lot of effort. Just good for variety. Okay. Now, on these roofs, rather than just leaving the tar paper there, what they would generally do is they would take planks and nail planks over the tar paper to hold it in place. And they would do this right along the cap of the roof. They would put some planks up there and nail them on to hold it along at the cap of the roof. It's a very important area. And I've glued those pieces on. Now we're just cutting some other pieces, and these pieces we're going to glue, or they would have nailed right over the joints, right against the tar paper to help strengthen the joints, because the joints, that's where the tears would most likely occur, was at the edge of these joints. So we would want to certainly put our protective strips, our planks, right on there. Very easy thing to do. Now here what I've done is I've taken some old dirty thinner, and I'm just weathering these a little bit. Now instead of using water base for weathering on these signs, I much prefer to use Tester's thinner. And what I do in order to pick up some color, I just want to, not a specific color, but I actually reach down to the bottom of my container of thinner. And you can actually use that color at the bottom of your container of thinner to weather the rest of the building. Or if you want a little more color, what you can do is reach into the thinner, reach down into another color. In this case, this happens to be black. I'm just putting very thin coats right over that tar paper there, over those signs a little bit, just as a way of a little stronger streaking. Very small amounts. In fact, it's hard to see that I'm putting any color on there at all. An important thing when you're weathering is to remember that you can always go back later and add more color over the top. And it's very important when you do this to let it dry completely before you add a second coat. So often the colors that we see when we're wet are not at all the colors we see when it's dry. Always want to work from the top to the bottom and put a little bit of this stain right on the wood timbers themselves. Want to cover the whole area, not necessarily uniformly, but you do want to cover the whole area. If you don't cover the whole area, you'll get little marks right at the edge where you put the stain and stuff. You can even put it right on the underlying wood, just like that. You always want to be very discreet in how much you're putting on. Now we're going to do some of the same type thing over on the other side of the building. Now here, I don't have the wooden strips. Don't know if you noticed that or not, but I don't have the wooden strips on the tar paper joints. That's because at this point those tar paper joints are still fresh and doing a good job. On the other side was where the tears had begun. So it's just a way of treating each side of the roof differently. People generally don't see both sides, and this way, no matter which direction they look at it from, they see something a little different. Variety in roofs are very important. And just continue adding this stain, very dilute, brushing it down. You can go back later and add other colors. Colors that I like to use are black, very thin down. I like to use a light color, like a very light tan. And I like to use sort of a rusty golden brown color. In artist terms, that would be raw sienna, but it's just a rusty golden brown color. What I'm doing is just touching little areas here of paint while this is wet. See, this is wet. Since it's wet, these that I put on just run right down to the bottom of the building. These little things run right down to the bottom of the building. If there's too much at the bottom, again, you can just run your paintbrush right along the edge of that, and that will pick up those paints from the bottom. You can blend several different colors together if you want. I really like the stuff down at the bottom of jars of thinner. It's such a mix of so many different colors, and it's a very dirty color. Just by definition, unless you've painted everything blue or something like that, there's only blue color down there. But my jars of thinner just really have a lot of different earth tones all mixed together, and I just really like the effect of it. Different pigments have different degrees of texture to them. And you can go back and work over the other area that we did before if you want to add a little bit more. Get a little bit of stain flowing down on these areas here too. Just want to look like dirt has accumulated and has flowed down. Very important to stop every once in a while when you're weathering. Let everything dry and look at it and see just how much of a weathering effect you have on it. Very easy to get carried away while doing this. And that's how it looks with that roof. Now in real life, if you see this on my layout, you'd realize it looks a lot redder than it does in this photograph. You don't want it too terribly colorful, but it's nice to have that red to supply some color. Now another thing that's nice to have on buildings are advertisements and signs that people have put up. Doesn't have to relate to the business itself. There's just all kinds of different things. These come out of magazines and books. Now this is a glossy paper, but what I'm doing here is I'm sanding the back of it. On a sign like this, and I didn't need this on the signs that I put on the roof, but on a sign like this, I really want to sand the back of it and make it as thin as possible. We want this sign to be as thin as possible because we're going to treat it almost like a decal. What we're going to do is we're going to glue it on the side of the building. I'm going to use full strength Elmer's glue, and then we're going to use a paintbrush to conform the shape of this sign to that of the siding on the building, to push it down into the grooves of the building. Notice while I'm doing this that I'm pulling the sandpaper from the center towards the edge, and that causes the edge to get a little warm. There in the lower, here on the upper left hand corner, you can see that's a little ragged up there. That's the type of effect we're looking for, just a little wear. So continue to do this. Then you paint your building with your full strength Elmer's glue, put your sign on it, and then what you do is take the edge of the paintbrush, see I'm pushing it right along the grooves at the bottom of each side of the siding there. A little hard to see with my hand in the way. Hard while doing these videos to always make sure that the camera has a good shot of what I'm doing. Okay, and there it's in place. Now it's a little shiny and a little glossy, so we want to tone that down. And the way we tone that down, there's different ways, of course. You can give it a shot of dull coat to tone it down, or you can just take, here I'm just taking some very thin black paint, acrylic paint, very thin, and just putting a coat on there. Now we're going to shift over to a different bit of detail, and here we're going to talk about smokestacks. Here I've got an ordinary drinking straw that we're all familiar with. It's got that little corrugated area there where it bends, but it won't stay in place worth beans. So what I've done is I've mixed up a little watery batch of plaster, and I've got a little syringe. This is the kind of syringe you get at the drugstore for giving medicine to children, and I suck that watery plaster right up into that syringe, and I squirt it right down inside that piece of straw. Okay, just I'm going to squirt all of it in. You can see that plunger slowly going in there. It's sort of hard to do. Get it all down in there. You want to make sure you get it so it goes around that curve. You want to make sure you get enough in there to go around that curve, okay? And if it's a see-through straw, you can sort of tell when you've done enough. And wipe off the plaster off the outside. So we got it there, and then we bend it, but now we need to get it so that plaster sets in there. So we take something like this square, in this case my little cutting device I use all the time that you're familiar with now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, not going to put the tube right up against it, but I put a piece of wood in there as a spacer, because that rounded part isn't square. We want to keep that round in there. What we do is put some weights on both sides just to hold that plastic stovepipe in position at a 90-degree angle. Get it at a 90-degree angle, just like that, and let that set up. Come back after that's set up, and you've got a stovepipe just that quickly, and it's going to maintain that shape because that plaster is inside and is doing it. And what I have here is an Exacto Miter Box. What I've done is I've glued a block of wood in it so that it doesn't go all the way to the bottom. That's because I like to use the Atlas snap saw, and that way I can use the Atlas snap saw in there to cut things. This is just a collection of tubing. K&S makes a bag of little pieces of tubing. The contents of that drawer cost me $7 several years ago, and it gives me all kinds of things to work with. Now, with this little miter box, you just hold it up against the side of your table. Take one of those pieces of tubing, and we're just going to cut it at a 45-degree angle. I'm just going to cut through there. We're going to cut 2 pieces. Then we're going to mix some epoxy. Want to make sure we get plenty. We're going to put this down the inside, these 2 pieces of tubing, to hold it together. And we want to mix this thoroughly. Again, the secret of epoxy is to mix it very well. A lot of people mix 2 parts and just run it together a little bit and expect it to set up and are disappointed when it doesn't do so. So here we've got 2 pieces we're going to make another kind of elbow with. And what we want to do is we want to stick these 2 together. Now, as that epoxy is setting up, we got a couple of minutes to work with. So I'm going to take a fine file and I'm just going to knock the edges off of these 2 pieces. There's a little bit of a burr there from when I sawed through that with my Atlas snap saw. You just want to get both sides cleaned up, just so you have a good joint. Now you can solder these together, of course, if you want to go to that effort, but I find it works better just to use some epoxy. So you hold it up, you let that liquid epoxy just drop right down into that opening and let it flow down inside. There, see how that just sucked right down in there? Now we want to do that on the other piece as well. This one's not going to flow down quite so easy, so I'm going to help it out a little bit here by sort of sticking it down in there. There we go, it's flowing in. Okay. And then we want to pick up a little bit of extra. We want the epoxy to be right there at the very edge of this, okay? We'll see if there's enough there to hold these together. You can tell it'll be a little tacky when you get it just right. And just set that up as a 90-degree. I want to add just a little bit more epoxy to that. This time I'm going to wipe across just to make sure I've got some bulging. Okay, you take those 2 pieces, hold them together at a 90-degree angle carefully, and then carefully remove your finger, and that gives you your thing. Now here I've taken that piece and I've put it onto the side of the building. Again, I drilled a hole through the wall. Here I put it where that window was. Put a little plastic piece with a hole in it to serve as flashing for it. And you can see I've got it painted. I painted it like a lot of greasy stuff, just like we painted the earlier smokestack. Now when you glue it through that wall there, sometimes you may need to put a block of wood behind there to hold it better. Drill a little hole in the roof on 2 points, run a piece of wire around to help hold the smokestack up, and there you end up with a very nice smokestack. Very little effort. Now here I'm pointing out that the smokestack should be above the roof line of your building so that it vents properly from the breezes blowing across and taking that smoke and carrying it away from your building. Next, I'd like to add a porch to this building, and what I'm pointing out here is in order for our porch to go across there, their sign is in the way. We need a support there, so we're going to have to move that sign up. Since we use just a tiny amount of glue to apply it, you can take a blade, this is an Exacto blade, a flat one, and just rock it back and forth, and if you're very careful, you can just pop this sign right off. Okay, there's the major piece, and the little outside trim pieces are left, and a little bit of working with them, and they'll pop right off. If you want to put a different kind of sign on, this is an excellent time to do it. And rather than clearing off those little bits that are left there, if you put a different sign on, that gives you, you can see that there was a sign before. Now here's the uprights for our porch. Now this, instead of the size I'm using here is scale 4x4s, and I use that. I use HO 8x8 to achieve that, or you can use scale 4x4s, either one. It's very important to make these supports spindly. Here I'm showing just how high we want that support to be. We want it to be just above the doorway. And that's how we determine the height, is by actually holding against the wall. Now I've got one of the supports there, and I got this bar going across, and of course this needs to be a little wider than the front of our building is. So just let it overhang a little bit on one side and then mark it on the other side. Now down on our walkway, we need to put a little notch there so that that will fit. So we want to cut a little bit of a notch out on both corners so that will fit. Very easily done. This is not the sharpest of Exacto knives, so it doesn't work all that easily, but it will get the job done. Now when we put these supports in, nothing to me makes a model look more like a model than to have porch supports that are too thick. It's something I see on so many different structures that people use just a standard size piece of wood, which is fine, but if you make it a little skinnier than you think it should be, it'll look better. This is one of the secrets of George Celios's kits that always makes them look good to me, is he makes things like the supports very spindly. We want it to look correct, and a 4x4 would be what I would use if I had a little cabin and I wanted to put a porch on the front of it, or if I had a little store like this, I'd use a 4x4. So once we've got that cut on both sides, here you can see my wood, and I'm looking for wood that's got, when I stained the wood, I took the time to cut out pieces that look very nice. Now to determine the size of this is very easy. I just set the structure itself on some graph paper and line it up against the lines. This way I can use those lines as guides to make sure that it's absolutely perpendicular. And then the part that goes on top that runs across, well, we're just going to glue that on right there. Right where those 2 points are, we're going to glue that on. Very easily done. So just pick the stick up, put glue on one end, not on both ends, and put it into position right where that notch is on your flooring there. And do it on the other side, and then just simply line up the piece of wood. And just that easy, you got that part of the porch made. Couldn't be any easier, could it? Take the time to get it just right. And we want to let this dry. So get it just right. Now again, I didn't use wax paper or anything like that. It doesn't stick that much. Now here, we got that joint there, but that doesn't provide an awful lot of support in and of itself. So what I want to do is I want to cut a few pieces to use to add strength. Today we use they make different metal pieces for joining pieces like this, but back in the old days they didn't have them. So they just did it the old-fashioned way by putting some supports in. So here I'm showing that I'm actually got 2 pieces of wood here, showing about how much I want it to be. Okay, now these little supports, I don't want them square at the top, but I want them to look nice, so I'm going to cut them at a 45-degree angle. And this is a scale 2x4. And that's going to go right against the 4x4, the uprights. And there's not an exact length. I just want to eyeball this. So I made this about a 1/2 inch long. And I actually made quite a few of these because we're going to use quite a few of these around the porch. So why don't you make about 10 or 12 of them while you're at it, just to have them ready. Okay, so we're just going to take that piece. There you can see the taper on the end of it, and you can also see it's about a 1/2 inch long. This is 1/4 inch square paper, and we're just going to glue that into place. Again, just using little tiny bits of glue, and we use the tweezers to put it into place, bring it flush up with the top of that 4x4 that runs across the top. And by squeezing on the sides, you can line it up with the tweezers and just use it as a tool, and also pick up any excess glue that may have squeezed out. And then we want to go over and work on the other side while we're letting the two pieces, the cross piece, dry. Again, just a little bit of glue on it. Drop it down into place. We want this to be flush with the top and even with the sides. Just a tiny, tiny little bit of glue. Little details like this, you don't have to have this on your model, but I find little parts like this, the more little parts I can add, especially if it's easy to add, adds a lot to the model. Now I also want to build some cross braces so that this doesn't sway too much. I like the looks of swaying and sagging porches, but it's easy to overdo it. So again, this is 2x4, and I've cut it at 45-degree angles on the end. And I want it so it goes on there just below that support piece. So I've glued that in place, and we've got this all ready to go. So now it's time to glue the uprights in. Very easy to do. You just add some glue in those little notches that you put on the porch. And we just glue this into place. Put it in one notch first, then pull it apart, or make sure it should be just a perfect fit. I'm trying to make these just a little bit tighter than normal so it'll hold on its own. And it will hold on its own, but we want it to be perfectly vertical. So I've got a plastic file box here. I'm just going to bring that flush up against it, and we want to make sure that that is straight up and down against there. So my little bottle of glue, excuse the back of my head there, anyway, this little bottle of glue, and we're just going to rotate that to hold it right there in place while that sets. Now you really want to take the time to do this carefully, and you want to let it dry thoroughly. So now that that has dried thoroughly, I want to add some supports to tie it in at the top. Right, like I have that paintbrush, something to run from the top of that over to the side of the building. Now if you've done this right, these parts are going to line up just right, and you can run it to the side of the building, but I'm going to run it right to the very front. I'm going to try to get it right against the very corner of that building, but still connect at the front. So to figure out how to do that, well, you'd think the logical thing to do is to cut it at the top, but it's really not. The logical thing is to actually cut it down at the bottom. This helps maintain it so that it stays nice and perpendicular. The uprights stay perpendicular. So mark it, cut it, and that's going to fit just like that. I'm going to have it fit on the side of the 4x4 upright post and fit flush against the front of the building, right at the corner. Want to make sure that that's going to be at a 90-degree angle. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can eyeball it, which if you're confident you can do is fine. Or you can take something like any kind of square piece of paper and put a mark on it and use that square piece of paper as a way to figure it out. So that's what we're going to do here. I've got some heavy square paper. I'm just going to hold that right in place there, right where it should be, lining up the left-hand part with that upright post. And then it's very easy to go over and very easily make a very faint mark. You can make that mark alongside the side, or if you choose, you can turn it around a little bit and put that mark on the front, whichever way you want to do it. You want that mark to be so light that you know it's there, but so that it's not really noticeable. So just a little tiny bit of a nick there will allow you to do that. Just enlarge it however much you need it in order to see it. Okay? Now to make it easier, what we're going to do is we're going to build a support. See how that leans a bit? Well, we're going to cut a little piece here that's going to fit between the post and the wall. Here I've got two marks. We're going to work with that closer mark. And what I've got here is I've got a 2x4 that I've turned on the side, and I'm going to see, I marked that piece for the width there at the bottom of the porch, but I'm going to have a little piece on the wall. So anyway, I need to cut that so that when I put this support piece in, that it's going to hold that porch upright vertical. Okay, see, there's a little bit of a gap there. See, it doesn't quite fill it all the way. That's because I've got that little piece right there that I glued on. See that little piece? Remember we put that little support piece up there at the top? Well, we have to compensate for that by cutting off 2 scale inches. Now when I put this in place, that's going to hold that porch out just the right amount. Now this is just propped in there because I'm going to glue this piece on the side of that upright post and against the front of the building. So I need to put glue first on the side where it fits there on the porch, and then on the end where it fits on the front of the building. And then just being very, very careful, put that right up into place. Since this piece of wood is so light, the glue is tacky enough to hold it in place, just like that. So there you can see I've got the lower support, and then I've got the cross beam that holds it in place. And of course, we want to do the same thing on the other side as well. Okay, now we're working with the other side. Again, we're putting a little bit of glue on the end where it goes against the wall, and on the side where it goes against this upright. Now I don't need to put a brace on both sides. A brace on one side, it's all that's needed is to keep the uprights vertical while we do this part. And we just carefully put this piece into position. And make sure that it's nice and level. After a bit of time you can eyeball these, and that's a pretty easy way to do it. Of course, a real carpenter would have made a mark there. Okay, so now you really want to let that dry again. Now as that's drying, it's a good time for us to go ahead and do some work on the front of the building for the supports for the rafters for the porch. So you want to determine just how high you want this to be. And this piece that runs across the top should be the same length as that cap piece on your porch. Want to make sure it runs level. Now I've got those nail holes that I put on there earlier, or those nail marks, and I can use those as a guideline. Let me show you that a little better. I'll show you that in a bit. What we want to do is we want to figure out how much of a slope we want on the porch. So just sort of eyeball it, figure out where that is, and use those nail holes as a reference so that you can see just where it is and how high to make that. Then you just want to, when we do that, we just run some glue along the back of it. We line it up and put it into position, running across there. Now it's important when you cut these pieces that you stain the ends of them after you've cut it. I do that, but I don't show that as part of the video here. But I do stain those pieces. There's those nail holes that I'm using as a reference. Okay, now this close-up you can see those nail holes. See how faint they are, but they're there. And we can use that to line this up so it's perfectly parallel. Now when I glue that on, notice that side pops up a bit. Well, I just take a little bit of cyanacrylate, and I'm just going to hold that piece down with the end of my paintbrush. Put a little tiny drop of cyanacrylate there on the top, and within just a couple of seconds that will glue. I let it dry on the other side first before doing this side, and then that way, see, that stays in place. So we've got that in place. Now we want to, at this point in time, we want to figure out the length of our rafters that are going to come and lay right there. We want to figure out how long they need to be. And again, this doesn't have to be exact, but just cut a piece and make sure that when you cut it, it works. Now along the edge there, we're going to position these one at the ends, one in the middle, one in between those, and then we're going to go back and put one in between each of those. So we're going to have a total of 9 pieces run across the front of this building. Now here, I've tapered the end so it fits against the front of the building, and I've put some notches there. I had to experiment a little bit with this piece to put those notches, and those notches are those notches that are going to fit against that railing there. Okay, so those bird's mouth cuts like we did on the roof rafters, we need to do that on these rafters too. Well, lining these all up, all these 9 pieces, and getting those notches on there, well, that can be quite a bit of a problem, so we have a solution for doing that. Of course, you could cut each of these and get them just right. You could put a little mark across there where it should be and cut each one and fit each one into place, but you know, I'm a lazy model builder. The name of this video is Easy Scratch Building in Wood. So what I want to do is line all those pieces up. Well, how do I do that? Well, I'm going to glue them together with Elmer's glue. So I've already got them stained, and what I do is I just take one and put a little tiny drop of glue at each end. We don't need a lot of glue for this, just a little bit, just enough to hold it together. And put the next one on top of it and hold it together. And add a little more glue to the next piece. Glue the next one in place. Very easy to do this. Doesn't take any time at all to go through and take 9 of these and glue them together. Then what you do is you line them up very carefully. See, right now I've got them so they can still be fanned apart, but I want to line them up. So I want to line them up on that sloped end so they're all the same. So you just hold it down against the wood and press on it, push them down, and you can get them lined up pretty good. Now to make sure that they're square, you want to push it down on your surface there, this plastic table. They don't stick to that. You want to put something at the end. Well, an Exacto knife isn't the thing to use. How about an emery board? Yeah, so we're just going to push all those up against the emery board. Once they're square, we push it down, and then we leave it alone and let it dry. Okay, now I've let it dry. Here you can see my notches. We're going to use that front one. So I've got that little mark that runs across there. I make that mark, make sure that mark is perpendicular. I'm going to take a nice brand new sharp razor blade and just very carefully, you don't want to cut through this, cut according to the angle of that notch. One of it is steep, the other is more gentle, and you just want to work at this a little bit at a time, rocking it back and forth, cutting through there. And what you're able to do, don't cut yourself doing this. Again, this is one of those things, hard to keep my hand out of the way while making the video, but very important to get this straight. And just work this and do it a little bit at a time, just like you were carving with a knife. Let's say you had a knife and we're working on these, or a chisel and working on these one at a time. You'd chisel them out. Well, I'm just using a razor blade. And there we got notches that run all straight across, all the way across. Just that easy. If you need to dress it up a little bit with an emery board, do that. Just dress it up a little bit. And when you're satisfied that you got that notch in there correctly, well, then you just take a little cup of water, drop it down in the water, push it down in the water, and let it set. Now, it only takes about 20 minutes for this to come apart. And you can do this with small pieces or big pieces. After it's soaked about 20 minutes, well, it's ready to come apart. Just that easy. So you just take them apart, pull them apart. Some of them may need a little bit of a pulling, but you can get them apart. You don't want to bust any of these. Make sure that it's soaked long enough to do this pretty easy. Now there's going to be a little tiny bit of glue on there. So take each one while it's wet and just rub it with your fingers, and you can remove all that glue. Now you got to stain this first, because if you do this and then stain it, it won't take the stain properly. That glue will seal it. And just set those aside to dry. That way you get 9 identical pieces just that easily. Don't even have to let these dry completely. You can go ahead with the next step without waiting for it to dry completely. So while those are drying, we're going to add another trim piece here. This is going to be a trim piece that supports that 2x4 that runs from the wall out to this post. We don't want it sagging, so we're just going to glue another 2x4 piece under it. Line it up, so that's brought right up against the bottom of it. And again, I've got that tapered part at the bottom. A little hard to do this with the camera stuck down there, but there. I think I got that one okay. And we do the same thing on the other side. And you see that just supports that 2x4. Now what you could do if you want to add some extra detail on this, I didn't add it here, but you can use some Grant Line nut and bolt washer castings to hold this porch together. It would be nailed or it could be bolted together. If you take the time to put the bolts on there, it'll make a nice little bit of detail on the front of the building. If you're building a model for a contest, you'd certainly want to do that. But if you're just building a model, it's going to go on your layout with a bunch of others. You can leave off the little details. Your choice. Okay, well that's how it looks right now. Now we can take that little brace out. It's dried enough there. Now I didn't glue this one quite flush with the side of the wall like I wanted it, so I'm going to have to move that. I am going to move that so it's flush against the outside of the wall. Over on this side, I did get it flush with the outside of the wall. But now we're getting to the point to where we're ready to add some more details. Now one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a support under this so that it would support it where it attaches to the front of the wall. Again, I like to do things recognizing it's sort of hard to do these things in real life, and they would have a bit of support under each side. Got that onto the other side. I want to do the same over on this side. Just a little bit of support there to help that be a little more durable. Now we'll go back over at the end of this and we'll paint all these white. And when I paint them all white, I want to just put the paint on lightly and then stain them. Now I want to put a little piece to attach right that runs along the side of the wall that also attaches. So you could nail this, the carpenter would nail this to the wall and then nail it to this beam that runs across there. Again, this is just lightly glued. Very small amount of glue. And do one of those on both sides. Now there's no need to run an angle brace here because since the wall of the building is going to remain square, we don't have to worry about the porch leaning. We only needed that angle support brace on the left and right front part of the building. Now we're going to begin installing our rafters. So I've put some glue at the top and one right there where the notch goes. I'm going to put one right at the extreme right hand side of the building, just like so. I'm going to take another rafter and do exactly the same thing. Glue on the ends. Wasn't careful there. I put it on the end instead of in the notch. Okay, but anyway, we want to get these glued just right. Any of these that are loose or wobbly, we can, after we get them lined up just right, we can always put a little drop of cyanacrylate to hold it on there. There we go, in the notch and on the ends. So we got these right at the extreme ends of the building. One right very close to the middle of the building. So those are the first three that we put on. Now we split the difference between these and we just glue another one in. So we don't have to measure this accurately. We can just put it in like such. And we just continue adding these. Again, these pieces are made from 2x4s. We want to keep this whole thing very light and open and spindly looking. Lightweight details add an awful lot to a building. Now you could leave just those 5 there if you wanted to leave just those 5. That would work. That would be fine, but it's just not that much more effort to add another one. Now we're adding these last 4, and we're just splitting the difference between our pieces we have in place. We're doing this all by eyeball, not being exact on this. No need to do this exactly. We did it exactly with our roof rafters because those were located directly over the studs for support. But here we're not doing it. We're just relying upon the cross braces. Very easily done. We just get that last one. We just glue that into place. Line them up as best we can by eyeball so that they look pretty good. And then we just set back and we're going to let this dry. Got to fuss with it a bit. Remember, one of them I didn't even have glue on there. Okay, we want to make sure that's level across there. I want to make sure it's level. If one of them protrudes up a little bit, then right there where it goes on that beam across the front, you want to take it off and file that notch a bit more. I'm just putting that emery board on there to make sure that those are nice and level and square. Got to be very careful to do that just right at this point. Now we're going to add some braces that run across to support our shingles. Now I just spread the glue right across on this. Doesn't have to have great contact. You could put drops of glue all the way across there, but doing it that way, but that's quite a bit of drops of glue. Whichever way you want to do it is fine. Up there's one that didn't stick. Again, when you build this at home, glue these into place and go away and do something and let it dry. Since I'm putting this video together, I want to maintain my continuity and everything, and I just building a lot of this without things being completely dry. Okay, so we just want this to fit right across. We're going to put that right up against the front of the building, just like that. And then we're going to go back right at the very tips of these pieces. We're going to put one right at the very end. Now these cross pieces that I'm gluing on here now, I want these to be very thin. Originally I put 1x6s that cut them, and I set them on there, and I decided I didn't want them. I wanted it airy. So these are actually would be 2x2s. Whatever size wood you use, just whatever you have. And you don't have to make it real lightweight. I just like it real lightweight. I think the spindly look adds so much to it. And again, we're just visualizing this. This is, didn't even have to measure this really. Just want to run a cross piece across here right at the middle. Very good. Very easily done. And then we're going to split the difference and run a piece there across. Right across that part there. Little tiny drops of glue. Just touching it. Each of these joints doesn't have to be secure. You know, you got 9 little drops of glue there, so that's going to hold it in place. If only 5 of them work out of the 9, that's fine. So they don't have to be big drops of glue. The only place we really care about is going to be the ends of these pieces. And I've got a little trick here to show you on how to make sure that those ends are nice and flush. I'll be showing you that here in a second. Okay, we get these lined up just as well as we can by eyeball. Okay, now what we want to do is I've taken clothespins, ordinary clothespins, and I've taken them apart and installed the spring in them backwards. And this way you get the springing pressure with very thin parts at the end. And I just take a thick piece of wood and clamp it on there. See how it moved that one up at the other end? That shows that these were not perfectly flat all the way across. And clamp it from the other side. Very good. And let this dry. Okay, once this is all dried and we've removed our clamp, next thing we're going to do is we're going to put shingles on here. Now for my shingles, I used a variety of wood, different widths. These would be a scale 6-inch and a scale 8-inch wide pieces. This should be the very thinnest material that you can get your hands on to make these from. And I just made a whole bunch of them. I'm not going to use all of them, but I cut a whole bunch just to have them, put them in there in a bowl. And you just dip one end in the glue and glue them on. And then when you put the row above it, overlap it where the joints are. And just work right across, pushing it down into place. If the one underneath lifts up a little bit, that's okay. It doesn't make any difference. Because in real life, these shingles would lift and twist and distort and everything. This proceeds very quickly. This is one of those type things that this part of the hobby, by the time you've gotten this far with the building, you've discovered whether you have the patience to build these kind of things or not. I find this to be one of the more enjoyable parts of the hobby, is putting shingles on. We all have our favorite parts. Bob Brown says his favorite part of the hobby is laying track. He likes gluing ties down and sanding the tops of them and laying track. And hand laying track is how he relaxes. Personally, that would drive me up the wall. But for something like this, I really like it. Now you'll notice I'm leaving gaps in between some of these. I'm making no effort to really push them up flush against the next one. The reason for that is because what happens with these shingles, when you put them up there, they twist, they bend, and they shrink as the moisture dries out of them, and they actually shrink, so there would be gaps would actually develop. Of course, as time went on, these shingles would split, since they're very thin pieces of wood, and they would fall away from where the nails held them into place. So on a roof like this, frequently you'll see missing shingles. Even on a roof that's a solid roof underneath, there'll still be ones that are missing. So that's how we do that. Now you don't want to sit and watch me do this whole thing. What I like is a weathered, open look on this building. Now you can go ahead and finish it and put all the shingles in place and cover it completely if that's what you would like. That's certainly your choice. What I'm doing here, I'm leaving a noticeable gap between this section of shingles and that section I completed there on the left. I just put a few of these in my hand at a time and work very carefully. One thing that I do when I put these things up in place, frequently I'll use my other hand to steady my hand. So one thing most people don't realize, you don't do these things independent. See, I rest my right hand, my left hand, and I rest my hand against it in order to steady it as I apply these things. So I'm using two hands, even though I can't get in there. Now again, it's very important to have a good pair of tweezers. I just really love these tweezers. I wish I had a few more. I think I guard these more zealously than I do any of my other tools. And my grandchildren, they take my tools and they end up all over the house, but these are ones I try very hard to make sure get back into my possession. My grandson is 11. He built a version of this building using these very same techniques, and he won the Gazette Award at the 2004 Narrow Gauge Convention because of that structure, using these very same techniques. So I know if my 11-year-old grandson can build these, that you can build this too. It's a very enjoyable hobby. When it comes to putting things like these shingles on, you can put on just as many or as few as you like. Just get it to where it looks the way you want it to look. I like to have the open look just so that one, people can easily see that it is built board by board, but I just like that look. I come from the deserts of California. Here in Alaska, buildings like this suffer terribly. They just don't last any length of time up here. The heavy snow loads, it's very hard to find any historic buildings up here because the weight of the snow completely destroys them. There's an operating gold mine about 50 miles out of town that I just love to go visit that operated right up through World War II. But in the 50 years since then, the snow has just completely destroyed most of the buildings. Fortunately, the state has stepped in and is rebuilding that site, so a lot of those buildings are being restored, but some of them are just destroyed to the point that they can't be rebuilt. But in the deserts of California, these structures survive very well, but they did get very weathered. I have a lot of fond memories of old weathered barns and other buildings out in the desert. I don't have any real desire to go back to living in the desert, but I'm glad that I grew up there. I grew up in a little tiny town in California, about 1,200 people. That was a railroad construction town. It was one of the areas where the Southern Pacific kept a lot of supplies, and there was a large Chinese population there during the construction of the railroad. Most of the town at one point in time had been what we would call Chinatown. And it had been abandoned. The Chinatown portion had been abandoned when I was a child. But I grew up playing in these old buildings. And the people in these old buildings had built tunnels underneath. There was one of them that there was no outside doors to the room at all. The only way to get to it was through these tunnels. There was physically a door there, but it was barricaded from the inside. And we decided that that was a gambling hall. There was a hotel, an old hotel in that town, and up in the attic of that hotel, when I was a child, I remember going up in the attic. They had these funny little wooden tables. They were about the size of, if you were to take a 4x8 sheet of plywood and build it about 6 inches off the floor, with legs about 6 inches off the floor, and put a little 2-foot wall running right the length of the table. That's what this was. I never understood what that was, but it turned out that was an opium den. And it was up in the attic of the hotel, so it was very low ceiling. Just fascinating to go through these old buildings. Well, there's a close-up of our roof as we've got it at this point. That's looking pretty good. Now we want to work on the sign. Now if you want to build a new sign for your structure, that's certainly fine. But I wanted my sign to look like when they put the porch on here as a later addition, they had to make the sign fit. So what they did was they had to cut down parts of the sign. So we're going to glue these different parts in there, and when you put them in, you can have it so that they go in nice and neatly, or you can have it so they don't. Now here I had to cut the top of this sign in order to put it in there, so I just cut it roughly into place to make sure it would fit. Now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to take my very sharp Exacto knife here, and I'm going to pick at this sign. Now remember, this sign is printed on paper. So I'm scoring this surface a bit, and I'm picking at and removing bits of the black Just I want this sign to look more weather beaten than what it was. So I'm just scraping at it. Being careful, you don't want to get carried away doing this. You just want to break it up enough that you can see that it's worn and weathered. Scoring it trying to do it in the direction of the grain. You just have little bits missing. Scrape a little bit more to get some of the color off, and then work on it in the direction of the grain. And you can see it's loosening up a little bit. Where it loosens up, you can stick a little bit of Elmer's glue under there and glue that back down. And we just want to do this on all the different parts of our sign here. Signs are a lot of fun to make. I really enjoy signs. One thing I always look for when I'm in a bookstore is I go to where their antique section is and look for books on antique signs, and a lot of times just cut those out. There's some really great books with antique signs available. Okay, now I want to glue those into position. I'm going to start by gluing the top part in right where I've cut it to fit the angle of that arch roof. I'm going to put that piece in, glue that in, and I'm going to pick up the middle part. I'm going to glue it in. Now, as I glue this in, you're going to notice that I'm not going to great lengths to bring these exactly together or to line them up perfectly. I want these to have some gaps in them when I get this sign finished. I want some definite gaps. Okay, now I'm putting that bottom one in and lining them up. Don't want it to look really bad, but I want it to definitely so that you can tell it's individual pieces of wood. So just play with that a little bit till it gets just right in your eye. I'm trying to get those gaps to where it looks good and everything. Yeah, sort of like the looks of that. Now, the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add some chalks around on the bottom. You can rub dirt into the wood, but that doesn't work too well, oddly enough. This wood's pretty hard. This is that pine that I use for, I got out of those coffee stirrers. So here I've got some charcoal pastels. I've had these pastels for probably 30 years now. And you can just take a stiff brush and rub it onto the pastel like that and transfer that color. Now you want to be careful doing this. Once you get this on there, it's awfully hard to ever get it off. The only way to get it off is to sand it. So you just want to figure exactly how this goes. You just want some dirt there on the porch. The porch would get dirty, but there'd be traffic wearing it down and everything. So I've put areas the way I like it, and I'm just going to take my emery board. This is one of those things that's hard to do and show because I got to hold it funny and everything like that. So I just take that emery board and I just roughen that up, and you just keep sanding at that until you sand it to the point that you think it looks just right. This brings out those individual boards. It's hard to see how much it brings out those individual boards, but doing this and sanding it brings out those individual boards. So just continue staining it. Now you can see how the stain looks there. Now here at the corners, I want to add some supports just like I did at the top parts. I just want to glue some supports here on the side. Again, these are 2x4s. And just clamp those into place. It's got the glue on it. Push it into place. Put one on the side. Again, these would be nailed so as to secure this post better so it didn't fall off. Kind of trim work they would do in real life. I'm just going to put 2 of these at each corner. Very easy. Hold your building down and push those right into position like that. Now you could get real fancy if you wanted and angle these, make them wider and everything, but this works fine just as a way of adding a little detail. And we're going to come back later. Of course, we're going to come back and paint these. There you can see how the porch looks. Nice weather-beaten look to it. And we're going to add these pieces here. I want to make sure I don't have it on pieces of wood. I want to make sure it's flush against the surface there. Now for a foundation, when you install this on your layout, flat rocks would be real good as a support for this foundation, or you could pour a concrete foundation for it above and beyond what we have here. Just whatever you want to do. Okay, so we just get these little pieces glued into place. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to take a little bit of white paint and just touch these up as well. You can leave these the way they are, or you can add a little bit of white paint. I decided I'd go ahead and paint these white. Looks just as good one way or the other. Now after you paint these white and these different posts and everything, you see I've got these posts painted white now, and I've painted the whole thing. And after the paint sets up, go back over these nice white areas with some brown stain that you've used. And just blend it in with the rest of the building. Well, that just about finishes up our building. I hope you've enjoyed this. Hope it encourages to build some on your own. It's a wonderful hobby. I enjoy it. I enjoy making these videos and sharing efforts. Remember, you can keep adding little details to this building as much as you want. There's all kinds of things. You might add a little side building. You can put a porch along the side of it. All kinds of things to do to improve it. But that's our structure just as we finished up. Okay, very nice. That's it.